Our passage today is from the Gospel of Matthew. This is chapter 9, verses 9 through 13. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And as he sat at dinner in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came and were sitting with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When he heard this, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick do. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners." So that was actually only the first half of the gospel lectionary text for today. And even though it's only 5 verses long, my experience this week was that if you do sit with it and you contemplate the very sparse details that it gives, the story becomes very evocative. And I think part of what makes it evocative and kind of intriguing is this move that happens in these very few verses. It begins outside in a public place at a tax collector's booth. But from there, it moves into a very private, intimate space, into somebody's home. And what a very, very strange mix of people to be sitting in this home having dinner together. And actually, this group of people would not have been sitting together, not like we might think of sitting around a table. The Greek word in this passage is recline. So it reads, "So as he reclined at dinner in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came, and they were reclining with him and his disciples." So in that time and place, people didn't sit in chairs around a table when they would eat. There were couches or maybe cushions sitting around the table, a low table, and people would actually get down on their sides and prop up their heads, and then with their other hand, they would reach out and eat. So these strangers would have been lying or reclining next to each other around this table. And I was thinking about this week. It made me think that level of comfortability and maybe vulnerability of lying next to somebody, that might shed some light on why eating with people and who you ate with carried such a high level of significance that maybe it doesn't for us. But even if we don't lie down next to each other at meals, I don't know, maybe we could try it. Next potluck. I do think we're all probably familiar with the experience of entering someone's home for the very first time. And maybe somebody that you don't know very well. Being in somebody's living space. It can be a very revealing moment. They all have their own smells. Depending on what room you're in, you might get hints of how the people who live there do certain things, how they set their spaces up, right? And you get the sense that this is where people in their lives are the most unguarded, in their homes. And this passage actually got me thinking about childhood. And being a kid and going to your friends' houses. And it got me thinking about the different kinds of friends that I had growing up. I think we probably all had different kinds of friends. And regardless of how you grew up, there were homes that you probably would go to that just felt different to you or felt foreign for one reason or another. So for instance, as I was thinking about this week, my parents, they didn't smoke cigarettes, and they didn't smoke cigarettes in the house for sure. They didn't really drink alcohol, at least around us. And so when I would go to a friend's house whose parents would be smoking in the house, and maybe they would be maybe drinking a little too much, depending on your perspective, or maybe their dad had some kinds of magazines that your parents didn't have, or that your parents did not approve of. When you're young, those kinds of differences make a very, very strong impression. Those homes felt different to me, right? It was like crossing an invisible barrier into a different world where people lived differently than you did. They didn't follow the same rules that you did. They didn't talk like you did. And I would not have known how to articulate that at that moment in that time. And I don't actually remember anybody talking about those differences or naming them. But as a kid, you understood on this subconscious level that there were actually different kinds of people. And whatever world you came from, you knew that there were these different kinds of people, different groups of people. Then I was thinking also, as a kid, where was the place that you most consistently encountered different kinds of people? You spend a lot of time there. Yeah, school, right. And then where at school were those differences most pronounced and enforced? Lunch, right? Lunch, at the meal. It is strange how foreign an institutional table could feel, depending on who's sitting at the table. That's where my mind went as I read this passage. And it made me realize this may have been the very first time that Jesus' disciples had been inside the home of a tax collector or somebody labeled a sinner. Someone who did not live like they lived, who did not follow the law like they did. Now, admittedly, the text does not actually say that it was Matthew's home where they went. It could have been one of the disciples' homes. But actually, this story is also in Mark and Luke. And in those versions, the tax collector's name is Levi. And it's Levi's home where they all go to eat and they encounter these tax collectors and sinners. Regardless of whose home it was, though, this would have been a really strange, uncomfortable situation for the disciples, and I would bet for the tax collectors too. Quite a strange group to be reclining together. It almost sounds like the premise of a comedy. These people ending up in the same home. But backing up, how did they end up here together, right? How did Jesus and the disciples get into this situation? Jesus had been walking along, and he saw this man, Matthew, sitting at the tax booth. He's a tax collector. And I think we're probably all relatively familiar, with how Israelites generally viewed tax collectors. They're lumped in with sinners, clearly. They're Roman collaborators, considered traitors. Many of them extorted money from their fellow Israelites. So when somebody looked at Matthew sitting at a tax booth, what they saw simply was a tax collector. That was who Matthew was. And I do think that it is part of our nature that when we look at other people that we don't know, we subconsciously make decisions about who we think they are. inevitably we end up reducing them to one part of who we think they are, right? It might be their job. It's easier if they're wearing a uniform. Or if it is outwardly apparent, we might reduce them to what we consider to be their shortcomings, or, and we use this language less and less, their sins, or what we assume their sins are, right? And that would be especially true in the case of Matthew. But today, I've never heard it in this group of people. We don't consciously label people as sinners. The boundaries, social, religious boundaries, they are not consciously enforced today like they were in Jesus's day. But I think we all understand that the boundaries are still there. They're more de facto than enforced. We don't think to ourselves, that person right there, that's a sinner, and I am going to avoid them in order to maintain my purity. I think something different happens, and I might be projecting, but I am speaking for myself, is that instead of that, consciously thinking that, what happens is I just do not see certain people. Subconsciously, certain people, I think, are invisible to us. What I think that means, tangibly, is that the thought would never even cross our minds that that person could actually be sitting with us in our dining room or in their dining room, sharing a meal. There would be a greater chance of me today being hit by a car than for something like that to happen, right? And if it did happen, it would make a very strong impression. Jesus, on the other hand, he takes note of Matthew for whatever reason. The text says, he was walking along and he saw a man called Matthew. He saw something about Matthew, something in Matthew, maybe, that other people, I'm sure, did not see, except maybe other tax collectors. I'm assuming tax collectors humanized each other. But I would also guess that Jesus saw something in Matthew that Matthew might not have recognized in himself. I'm always surprised in these stories when Jesus calls his disciples, how quickly they seem to get up and follow. Follow me. And he got up and he followed. And this week I thought, maybe it's because they're so shocked. Maybe they're caught off guard by this. This teacher wants me, the tax collector, to follow. Why? Well, this truth about Jesus that we see in the Gospels, right? The truth about him, the characteristic about him, right? That he sees Matthew, right? That he sees something about him, about who he is, where other people would just have written him off, not seen him, judged him, whatever. I've been thinking about that characteristic of Jesus. And ultimately what it says about him, and actually what it says about God, and the implications of that. And we see one implication that we see comes when we put ourselves in the place of Matthew in this story. And the implication is that Jesus and God actually sees us for who we are. That he sees things in us that we might not expect about ourselves. And that he calls us to things that we would definitely not imagine for ourselves. I am sure that morning, Matthew did not guess that he was going to end up eating with Jesus and the disciples. That would have been a surprise. Let alone that he would become one of the 12 disciples. The other implication comes when we put ourselves in the place of the disciples in this story. So it's not just Jesus who goes with Matthew and eats with him. He brings along the disciples. And I think what's happening here is that Jesus is teaching the disciples how to see Matthew. He's teaching them how to see and regard other people. And these two sides of the coin, right? Jesus seeing us, and then Jesus teaching us how to see other people. I think these are mutually reinforcing. They work together. And we see it coming together in this meal, in this really strange meal. And it's not actually just a meal. Meals are never just meals in the Gospels. In the Gospels, meals often symbolize the great banquet, the great feast that will happen at the end of time. So in this meal at Matthew's house, what we see is actually a small glimpse of the final banquet at the end of time. Now, I think often in American Christianity, we've kind of been taught to think about salvation as primarily an individual experience, right? So Jesus forgives us for our personal sins. Hopefully he changes us so that when we die, we get to go to the good place. But this story envisions salvation actually very communally. So for the tax collectors, for the sinners, and raise your hand if you do not place yourself in one of those categories. Or for people who go largely unseen or who are judged, disregarded, what salvation means is being reintegrated into the community of faith. And this is actually what the Mennonite Church calls the work of Jesus and the work of the church. They call it the ministry of reconciliation. So reforming, bringing things back together, bringing people back to God, and actually bringing people back to people. I do think that we should see even our little community here as a possible glimpse, very small glimpse of the great banquet at the end of time. I think that changes how we see what we do here. Our work as the church, as a reconciling community, empowered to do the work that we see Jesus and the disciples doing with the tax collectors and the sinners. And I guarantee there were ways that those tax collectors ministered to the disciples and taught them things too. Right? But the work is first being seen, allowing yourself to be seen by Jesus, right? Have his gaze get into you. And then on the other hand, having Jesus teach us how to see other people. And we see that work happening in the apostles after Jesus' resurrection, where they are being transformed by Jesus, but at the same time, they're going into Gentile regions. They're going into Gentile homes, strange homes, where they're preaching this good news. This work is a calling, and it is work. And I think it does require a willingness to reconceive of our mission as a congregation. So it is very easy for church to become a place where we get together with people that we're already friends with, or to gather with our kind of people. But that's not what the church is. It's a place where we come together as a group to place ourselves under the influence of the Holy Spirit, which actually does that work of of mending and healing divisions. In the name of Jesus. Amen.